fragile duke sought comfort till morning, and woke to feelings he couldn't deny. The last of the winter light bled from the sky, staining the bruised clouds purple and gray over the rooftops of Bath. From her cramped attic room, Alara Croft watched the lamplighters begin their nightly ritual, their small flames chasing away the encroaching gloom. The gloom, however, had long since taken root inside her own heart. It had been 3 months since her father's passing, 3 months since the creditors had descended like vultures, leaving her with little more than her mother's locket and a name that no longer carried any weight. The threadbare damask of her gown was a constant, humiliating reminder of her precipitous fall from genteel poverty into the abyss of true destitution. Her hands, clasped in her lap, were cold, the knuckles chapped from scrubbing floors at the boarding house where she now resided, a place of boiled cabbage smells and the perpetual damp that seemed to seep into one's very bones. A letter lay on the small, rickety table beside her. The wax seal was plain, the script within severe and economical. It was an offer, a lifeline so unexpected it felt like a trap. A position as a companion to the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, at her remote estate in the northern fells. The solicitor's letter had been vague on the details of the Duke himself, mentioning only that he was a recluse and that his aunt, the Dowager, required gentle company. The salary offered was a fortune to a woman who now counted her pennies for a loaf of stale bread. It was escape, it was survival, and yet, a tremor of apprehension ran through her. Blackwood Manor had a reputation, a dark whisper of a place ruled by a spectre, a man ruined by war, known only as the Beast of Blackwood. Miles away, in the heart of that very darkness, Lord Alastair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, stood before a grand, gilt-framed mirror and saw not a duke, but the monster of the whispers. Rain lashed against the library's tall, arched windows, a furious, relentless drumming that echoed the tempest in his soul. The fire in the hearth spat and hissed, its flickering light a cruel artist, deepening the shadows that clung to him and illuminating the jagged, silvered scar that cleaved through his left eyebrow and down his cheek, a permanent reminder of the bayonet that had nearly claimed his life on a blood-soaked field in Spain. The physical wound was a pale imitation of the wounds within, the ones that festered in the silence of the long nights, filled with the ghosts of men he had led to their deaths. "It is the only way, Your Grace," a calm, rational voice said from the depths of a wingback chair. Mr. Davies, his solicitor for 20 years, regarded him with a steady, impassive gaze. "The entail is absolute. You require an heir. These London seasons, these simpering debutantes and their grasping mothers, they would not suit. You would not tolerate them for a day." Alastair's hand tightened on the crystal tumbler of brandy, the liquor a fiery bomb that did little to quell his inner chill. "And this solution of yours is better? To bring a woman here under false pretenses? To parade her before me like a broodmare at auction, while I hide behind the guise of a common employee?" The words were acid on his tongue. "It is dishonorable. It is practical," Davies corrected smoothly. "Miss Croft is of good family, though impoverished. She is educated, reputedly kind, and desperate. She will believe she is here merely as a companion to your aunt. You, in turn, will be introduced as Mr. Ashworth, the estate manager. It will grant you the opportunity to observe her true character, to see if she is worthy of the title, without the title itself dazzling her. Is her heart kind? Is her spirit generous? Or is she merely another piece of polished porcelain, beautiful but empty? This way you will know." Alastair turned from his monstrous reflection, the scarred side of his face cloaked in shadow. The plan was a grotesque masquerade, a deception that chafed against the bedrock of honor that had, thus far, survived the war. But the alternative, a marriage of cold calculation to a woman who would flinch from his touch and recoil from his face, was a vision of a private hell he could not endure. He was fragile, a man held together by pride and routine, and the thought of a lifetime of feigned affection was a horror beyond even the battlefield. He had to know, for once in his life, if he could be valued for the man he was, not the title he held. A fragile duke sought comfort till morning, and woke to feelings he couldn't deny. The thought was a prayer and a curse. He gave a short, sharp nod. Very well, Davies. Arrange it. But if I find her wanting, she is dismissed. I will not be shackled to a fool or a shrew. 2 weeks later, the carriage carrying Alara Croft rattled through a pair of immense, wrought iron gates, the blackwood crest of a snarling wolf's head glaring down from the stone pillars. The grounds were vast and wild, the trees ancient and gnarled, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the oppressive gray sky. The manor itself rose from the mist-shrouded landscape not as a home, but as a fortress, a formidable pile of granite, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the untamed fells. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, traced a path down Alara's spine. She was met not by a welcoming party of servants, but by a single, severe-looking butler who led her through cavernous, echoing halls to a small, but well-appointed sitting room. A fire crackled in the hearth, a lone point of warmth in the chilling grandeur. Seated before it was a woman with a ramrod-straight spine and eyes the color of faded periwinkles, sharp and intelligent despite the fine web of wrinkles around them. "Miss Croft," the Dowager Duchess said, her voice surprisingly firm. "You are punctual. I approve of punctuality." She gestured to the chair opposite. "Sit. The journey is arduous." Before Alara could voice her thanks, the door opened again. The man who entered seemed to draw all the shadows in the room toward him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed not in the finery of a duke, but in the practical, well-made clothes of a country gentleman or an estate manager. His hair was the color of jet, his features harsh and angular. And then he turned fully into the firelight, and Alara's breath caught in her throat. The scar was stark, a brutal line of silver against the bronze of his skin, pulling at his brow and giving his expression a permanent, fearsome severity. "My nephew's estate manager, Mr. Ashworth," the Dowager announced, her tone clipped. "He sees to the running of this place. You will likely have dealings with him. Mr. Ashworth, this is Miss Croft, my new companion." The man, Mr. Ashworth, inclined his head, a gesture so curt it was almost an insult. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, swept over her, and Alara felt as though she were being weighed and measured, her worn traveling cloak and mended gloves catalogued and found wanting. There was no welcome in his gaze, only a cold, assessing scrutiny. "Miss Croft," he said, his voice a low, rough baritone that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Welcome to Blackwood." The words were correct, but the tone was anything but welcoming. It was a challenge. Alara lifted her chin, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. Her life had been stripped down to its barest essentials. She had nothing left to lose but her dignity, and she would not surrender that to a grim-faced, judgmental estate manager in a house of shadows. The deception had begun, and its first casualty was the truth of the man standing before her, a duke hiding in plain sight, already judging the woman he was meant to test. The first weeks at Blackwood were a study in quiet observation and veiled tension. Alara's days fell into a gentle rhythm dictated by the Dowager Duchess, a woman whose formidable exterior concealed a sharp wit and a deep-seated loneliness. They read aloud, played cards, and took slow, measured walks in the conservatory when the weather was too foul to venture outside. Yet Alara always felt a second pair of eyes upon her. Mr. Ashworth was a constant, brooding presence at the periphery of her life. He would appear silently in a doorway as she arranged flowers, or she would look up from a book to find him standing at the far end of the long gallery, his gaze fixed upon her. His interactions were always brief, couched in the language of estate business. "The Dowager mentioned you have a head for figures, Miss Croft," he stated one afternoon, cornering her in the morning room with a heavy ledger. "The household accounts are in a state. See if you can make sense of them." It was not a request, but a command. Alara spent 2 days poring over the chaotic entries, her brow furrowed in concentration. She discovered redundancies, overpayments, and a startling lack of organization. With neat, precise script, she restructured the entire system, creating a clear and efficient record of expenditures. When she presented the revised ledger to him in the library, he took it without a word of thanks. his gray eyes scanning her work with unnerving intensity. "You have a practical mind," he conceded, his tone grudging. He looked from the pages to her hands, which were resting on the polished mahogany of the desk. They were slender and pale, but her nails were short and clean, her fingers capable. Not the useless, decorative hands of the women he knew. He had expected her to protest the task, to deem it beneath her station as a gentlewoman. She had not. The tests continued, subtle and relentless. He would ask her opinion on the replanting of the North Woods, a subject she knew little about, simply to see if she would feign knowledge. She did not. "I am afraid my expertise is in ledgers and literature, Mr. Ashworth, not forestry," she admitted with a disarming honesty that pricked at his cynicism. He watched how she treated the staff, noting the quiet respect she afforded the maids and the genuine smile she gave the cook. She never demanded, only requested, and her thank you was always sincere. This, more than anything, began to erode the foundations of his prejudice. The women of his class saw servants as invisible, as furniture that moved. Alara saw them as people. The true turning point came on a day of furious, windswept rain. A message arrived from the home farm. A section of the roof on the bailiff's cottage had collapsed, and his youngest child had been injured by the falling debris. While the dowager fretted and the butler prepared to send for the distant village doctor, Alara acted. She threw on a heavy cloak, gathered clean linens from the press and a tin of her own personal salve, and, to the astonishment of the entire household, announced she was going to the cottage. "That is not necessary, Miss Croft," Mr. Ashworth said, his voice sharp as he intercepted her at the main door. The wind howled outside, rattling the very stones of the manor. "A groom will go." "A groom is not a nurse," she replied, her chin set at a stubborn angle. "I have some small skill in these matters. The child may be frightened. A woman's presence might be a comfort." Before he could argue further, she was gone, her slight figure swallowed by the gray, swirling tempest. Alistair, torn between irritation at her willfulness and a strange, unwelcome flicker of admiration, followed a few moments later on horseback. He found her in the small, chaotic cottage, kneeling on the damp stone floor. The bailiff's wife was weeping, but Alara was a portrait of calm competence. She had cleaned and dressed the little girl's cut, her voice a low, soothing murmur that had already quieted the child's sobs. She then organized the men to secure a tarpaulin over the gaping hole in the roof, her instructions clear and practical. He stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, and watched. He saw not a delicate, impoverished gentlewoman, but a woman of immense inner strength and boundless compassion. She worked with a quiet efficiency that was more commanding than any shouted order. The sight of her, so thoroughly in her element amidst chaos and distress, struck him with the force of a physical blow. His carefully constructed test, his cynical experiment, was being dismantled not by a grand gesture, but by a simple act of profound human kindness. He had intended to judge her worthiness, but in that moment, drenched and unseen in the doorway of a tenant's cottage, he felt a humbling, terrifying certainty that it was he who was being judged, and he who was being found wanting. Her resilience was a quiet fire, and he was beginning to feel its warmth melt the permafrost around his heart. The nights were the worst. In the suffocating silence of his vast, lonely bedchamber, the war always returned. It came not as a noble memory of duty and courage, but as a visceral onslaught of sound and terror. The shriek of cannon fire, the stench of blood and mud, the weight of a dying friend in his arms. Tonight, the phantoms were particularly relentless. Alistair woke with a strangled cry, his heart hammering against his ribs, the sheets twisted around him like a shroud. A cold sweat slicked his skin. The scar on his face pulsed with a phantom ache, a ghost of the steel that had carved it. He threw back the covers and rose, pacing the room like a caged animal. The brandy decanter on his dresser offered a familiar, inadequate solace. He did not know what he needed. Space. An escape from the prison of his own mind. He pulled on a dressing gown, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and made his way through the sleeping house, his bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. He found himself drawn, as he often was, to the library. The room was his sanctuary, a fortress of leather-bound knowledge and silence. But tonight it was not empty. A single lamp cast a warm, golden circle of light near the hearth, where a low fire still burned, warding off the deep chill of the ancient house. Curled in one of the large wing-back chairs, a book lying open in her lap, was Alara. She must have fallen asleep while reading. Her head was tilted to one side, her dark lashes resting against her cheek. In sleep, the guarded composure she maintained during the day had fallen away, revealing a vulnerability that mirrored his own. He must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, because her eyes fluttered open. They were hazy with sleep for a moment, then cleared, widening in surprise as she saw him. He stood frozen in the shadows, a disheveled specter, his hair wild, the raw agony of his nightmare still etched on his face. He felt a hot flush of shame. He was the Duke, the master of this house, and she was seeing him undone, stripped of his authority and his armor. His first instinct was to retreat, to bark an order for her to return to her room. But the words would not come, and she did not gasp, or recoil, or look at him with the pity he so despised. Instead, her expression softened with a quiet concern that was utterly devoid of judgment. "Mr. Ashworth?" she asked, her voice soft, still thick with sleep. "Are you unwell?" He moved into the light, the full extent of his disarray exposed. He felt the scar on his face tighten, as if it were a brand marking him as damaged, broken. "A bad dream," he managed to say, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He walked to the decanter on a side table and poured a measure of brandy, his hand shaking so badly that the spirit sloshed over the rim of the glass. He expected her to make an excuse, to flee his unnerving presence. She did not move. She simply watched him, her gaze gentle. "The wind is loud tonight," she offered, as if giving him an excuse for his state. "It can conjure all sorts of phantoms." It was such a simple, understanding remark. It was not a question, not an intrusion, but an offering of peace. He drank the brandy in one searing gulp and turned to face her, leaning heavily against the mantelpiece. The firelight danced across the harsh planes of his face, illuminating the exhaustion and the pain he kept so carefully hidden. "It is not the wind," he said, the confession torn from a place deep inside him. "It is the silence that follows." He did not know why he said it. He had never spoken of it to anyone, not to Davies, not even to his aunt. But in the warm, firelit stillness of the library, with this quiet, unassuming woman, the words simply fell from him. Alara's heart ached with an empathy so powerful it was a physical sensation. She saw past the scar, past the forbidding title of estate manager, and saw only a man drowning in a sea of private sorrow. She thought of her own grief, the hollow emptiness her father's death had left behind. Her pain was a quiet pool. His was a raging ocean. She rose from her chair, and for a terrifying moment, he thought she would approach him, touch him. The thought of a compassionate touch was both a desperate craving and an unbearable threat. But she kept her distance. She moved to a heavy chest in the corner and drew out a thick woolen blanket. "My father used to say that a chill in the soul is best fought with a warmth from the outside," she said softly, her back to him. She returned not to his side, but to her own chair, draping the blanket over it. Then she sat, folding her hands in her lap. She did not offer the blanket to him. She simply made it available, a silent invitation without pressure. She looked at the fire, not at him, granting him the space to collect himself. "He was a scholar," she continued, her voice a low, melodic thread in the quiet room. "He believed books held all the answers. But when my mother died, he found they held none at all. He found comfort instead in sitting by the fire, just like this. He said the flames were like memories, some bright and warm, others that flicker and fade. She was giving him a piece of her own story, a piece of her own pain, as a bridge across the chasm of his isolation. He stared at her calm profile illuminated by the fire. For the first time since his return from the war, he did not feel like a monster being observed. He felt like a man being seen. Slowly, hesitantly, he crossed the space between them. He did not take the chair she had prepared, but sank into the one opposite hers. He did not speak. He did not have to. They sat in a shared, companionable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. The ghosts receded, pushed back not by brandy or by willpower, but by the simple, profound grace of a woman who had met his darkness not with fear, but with a quiet, steady light. That night in the library became a silent turning point. The formal distance between them began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative, unspoken understanding. Alistair found himself manufacturing reasons to seek Alara out, his pretense of estate business growing thinner with each passing day. He would ask for her assistance in cataloging the library's extensive collection, a task that stretched into hours of quiet companionship, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same leather-bound volume. In these moments, a jolt of awareness, potent and unsettling, would pass between them. He learned the landscape of her mind. She possessed a quick, curious intelligence and a gentle humor that surfaced in unexpected moments. She would read a passage from a satirical poet, and the corner of her mouth would twitch with suppressed laughter, a sight that made something in his chest ache with a feeling he refused to name. In return, he found himself speaking to her as he spoke to no one else. He told her of his plans for the estate, of his passion for architecture, pointing out the elegant symmetry of the manor's design, a beauty he had long since ceased to see. She listened with an attentiveness that made him feel, for the first time in years, truly heard. The north wing was designed to capture the morning light, he explained one afternoon as they stood before a large, dust-covered window in a disused gallery. My grandfather believed a house should breathe with the day. It's a beautiful thought, Alara murmured, tracing the grimy pane with her finger. It feels sad that these rooms have been closed off for so long. All this light, with no one to see it. Her words were a simple observation, but they struck him as a profound metaphor for his own life. He had closed himself off, shuttered the windows of his soul, and left himself in darkness. And here was this woman, effortlessly pointing out the waiting light. The deception he was perpetuating began to feel like a lead weight in his gut. Every genuine smile she gave him, every moment of shared laughter, was a fresh turn of the screw. He was falling for a woman who did not even know his name. He was earning her trust, her respect, her burgeoning affection, all on the foundation of a lie. The guilt was a constant, bitter companion. One blustery afternoon, he found her in the walled garden, a forgotten, overgrown tangle of weeds and thorns that had once been his mother's pride. She was on her knees, her hands protected by thick gardening gloves, patiently clearing the weeds from around a stubborn, resilient rose bush that had somehow survived years of neglect. "This place is a wilderness," he said, his voice startling her. She looked up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "It is," she agreed, a determined glint in her eye. "But the bones are still good. It just needs time and care." He watched her work, her movements efficient and tender. She was nurturing this neglected patch of earth, coaxing life back from the brink of decay. The symbolism was not lost on him. He felt like that garden, wild, overgrown and thorny, and he felt a desperate, terrifying yearning for her to be the one to tend to him, to see the good bones beneath his own wilderness. The internal conflict raged within him. Davies's practical plan now seemed like a cruel mockery. He had wanted to test her character, but it was his own that was failing. He was a coward, hiding behind a false name, too afraid to face her as he truly was, too terrified that the Duke of Blackwood would repel her where the humble Mr. Ashworth had not. He had seen how she looked at him now, with a warmth that went far beyond the professional respect of an employee. He saw it in the way she lingered in a room when he was there, in the soft blush that rose on her cheeks when their eyes met for a little too long. and it both thrilled him and filled him with a profound self-loathing. He was winning her heart under false colors, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the moment the truth was revealed, he would lose her completely. The very test designed to secure his future happiness was methodically destroying any chance he had of ever truly attaining it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, its crisp parchment and ostentatious seal a stark intrusion into the quiet world of Blackwood. Lord Vesey, a neighboring landowner with a reputation for amoral ambition and a predatory charm, had somehow learned of the new acquisition at the manor. Assuming Alara to be a poor but well-connected relation of the Duke's, he announced his intention to call upon them, his flowery prose barely concealing his intent to inspect the merchandise. Alastair read the letter in his study, a cold, primitive rage building within him. The very idea of a man like Vesey laying his oily gaze upon Alara was intolerable. He was consumed by a jealousy so fierce and possessive it shocked him. This was not the detached observation of a duke vetting a potential bride. This was the raw, territorial anger of a man protecting what was his. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He thought of her as his. "He cannot come," Alastair said, his voice a low growl. His aunt, who was seated opposite him, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "On the contrary," the dowager replied, her tone laced with a knowing irony. "He must. It will be illuminating." She had been watching the slow, tender dance between her nephew and her companion with sharp-eyed approval. She knew the truth of Alastair's feelings long before he had admitted them to himself. Vesey arrived 2 days later, all polished boots, cloying cologne, and condescending smiles. He greeted the dowager with practiced flattery, but his eyes were fixed on Alara, subjecting her to a slow, insolent appraisal that made her skin crawl. He addressed her with a patronizing familiarity, his questions about her family and circumstances designed to emphasize her dependent position. "A companion, you say?" Vesey drawled, looking Alara up and down as if she were a horse he was considering for purchase. "A charming occupation for an unattached lady, but surely a woman of your attributes. Hopes for a more permanent establishment." Alara's back stiffened. "I find my current position perfectly satisfactory, my lord." Alastair, introduced once again as the humble Mr. Ashworth, stood by the fireplace, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every word Vesey spoke was a new spark on the tinder of his fury. He watched Alara handle the man's odious insinuations with a cool, unshakable dignity that only deepened his admiration. The situation came to a head in the drawing room after dinner. Vesey, emboldened by wine, cornered Alara by the pianoforte. "Blackwood is a dreary place for a pretty thing like you," he murmured, stepping into her personal space. "The Duke is a recluse, a monster, they say, scarred and mad. You are wasted here. My own estate is a far livelier place. Perhaps you would consider a change of scenery? I could find a position for you." The insult was unmistakable, his offer as vulgar as it was cruel. Alara's face paled, but before she could deliver the scathing retort that was forming on her lips, a voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as splintered ice. "Lord Vesey." Alastair had crossed the room in 3 silent strides. He was no longer the unassuming estate manager. He stood tall, his presence utterly commanding, his gray eyes blazing with a cold fire that made Vesey take an involuntary step back. The sheer, unadulterated power radiating from him was terrifying. "Miss Croft is a guest under the protection of this house," Alastair said, his voice dangerously soft. "And I am the man who manages that protection. You have enjoyed our hospitality for long enough. Your carriage is waiting." Vesey blustered, his face reddening. "Here now, Ashworth. A man of your station has no right—" "My station," Alastair interrupted, taking a deliberate step forward, "is to ensure that vermin do not infest the Duke's property. I suggest you leave now, before I am forced to forget you are a guest and treat you as the pest you are." The threat was naked, absolute. There was no mistaking the promise of violence in his stance. Vesey, a bully and a coward, paled. He stammered a hasty farewell to the dowager and practically fled the room. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Alara stared at Alistair, her heart pounding. The authority he had just displayed, the sheer force of his will, was breathtaking. It did not belong to an estate manager. It belonged to a man born to command, a man who owned the very ground on which he stood. For the first time, a sliver of doubt, a tiny, unsettling question about Mr. Ashworth's true identity, lodged itself in her mind. He had protected her, fiercely and without hesitation. He had defended her honor as if it were his own. And in his eyes, as he finally turned them to her, she saw not just the lingering anger, but a raw, unguarded emotion that looked terrifyingly like love. The lie that separated them had suddenly become a chasm, and the ground beneath her feet felt perilously unsteady. The aftermath of Vesey's visit left a tangible tension in the air, a web of unspoken thoughts and unacknowledged feelings. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. Alistair had revealed a part of himself, a core of protective, absolute authority that Alara could not reconcile with his supposed station. The incident had ripped away a layer of his disguise, exposing the steel of the Duke beneath the tweed of the manager. A few days later, a fragile sun broke through the persistent cloud cover, bathing the fells in a soft, golden light. Seeking refuge from the charged atmosphere of the house, Alara had returned to the walled garden. Her work there had become a form of therapy, a way to bring order and beauty to one small corner of a world that felt increasingly chaotic. The overgrown beds were now cleared, the soil turned, and the resilient roses she had first discovered were budding, promising a flush of crimson against the old stone walls. She was kneeling, gently loosening the earth around a lavender bush, when she sensed his presence. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. The very air seemed to shift when he was near. "You've worked a miracle here," Alistair said, his voice softer than she was used to. He stood a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, looking not at the garden, but at her. "The garden did most of the work," she replied, not meeting his gaze. "It just needed to be allowed to breathe." He took a step closer. Like all living things, the silence that fell was freighted with meaning. He was not talking about plants. Alara finally looked up, her gardening gloves lying forgotten on the soil. His expression was stripped of its usual severity. The harsh lines of his face were softened by a look of profound, aching vulnerability. The scar seemed less a mark of violence and more a map of his pain. "Alara," he said, and the sound of her Christian name on his lips, spoken for the first time, sent a shiver through her. "What I did the other night with Vesey, He struggled for the words, a man unaccustomed to the language of the heart. "I could not stand by and hear him speak to you with such disrespect. You defended my honor, Mr. Ashworth," she said quietly, a faint emphasis on his name. "I am grateful." "It was more than that," he insisted, taking another step until he was standing directly over her. He crouched down, bringing himself to her level, an act of submission that was utterly at odds with the powerful man who had dismissed a lord from his home. "What I feel for you, it has nothing to do with gratitude or honor. It is—" He shook his head, a look of frustration and wonder on his face. "I have spent years in darkness, Alara. I had resigned myself to it. And then you came. You came into this house of shadows, and you were not afraid. You brought light." His confession hung in the warm, still air. It was not a declaration of love in the poetic sense, but it was something far more potent, a testament to the effect she had on his wounded soul. He had never met a woman of such integrity, such quiet strength, such innate goodness, and the lie he was living felt like a blasphemy in her presence. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently touched the smudge of dirt on her cheek, his thumb brushing it away. His touch was electric, a searing point of contact that seemed to burn through every one of her defenses. His gaze dropped to her lips. The world narrowed to the space between them, the scent of damp earth and blooming roses, the sound of their own unsteady breathing. "I have no right," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. I have no right to ask for anything from you. But he was asking. His eyes were pleading with her. And in that moment, all the questions about his identity, all the inconsistencies, faded into irrelevance. There was only the truth of this man, this wounded, lonely man, offering her the most honest part of himself. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. That was all the encouragement he needed. He cupped her face in his hands, his palms rough against her skin, and lowered his head. The first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration, as if he feared she might shatter. But then she responded, her own hand rising to rest on his wrist, and something broke loose within him. The kiss deepened, becoming a vessel for all the unspoken yearning, the desperate loneliness, the fragile, burgeoning hope that had grown between them in the silent corridors of Blackwood. It was a kiss of profound connection, of two fractured souls finding a moment of perfect, breathtaking wholeness. And it was built entirely on a lie. As he held her, the sweet taste of her on his lips, the agony of his deception was a physical torment, a shadow falling over the most beautiful moment of his life. The fragile peace wrought by their kiss could not last. It was a beautiful, sunlit moment before the breaking of a storm that had been gathering since Alara's arrival. The storm broke as they often do, not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet, insidious turn of events. The Dowager Duchess, whose health had been delicate for some time, caught a chill that swiftly developed into a fever. The house was thrown into a state of quiet panic. The village doctor was summoned, but his prognosis was grim, his remedies of little use against the tide of her advancing age and weakness. Alara, refusing to be idle, took it upon herself to nurse the old woman. She sat by the dowager's bedside day and night, bathing her brow, coaxing spoonfuls of broth between her pale lips, and reading to her in a low, soothing voice. Alistair was a constant, tormented presence, hovering in the doorway, his face a mask of anguish. He felt utterly helpless, the one person who had been a constant in his tumultuous life now slipping away from him. It was on the third night of the vigil, in the deep, hushed hours before dawn, that the world came undone. The dowager had been restless, caught in the grip of a feverish delirium. Alara was adjusting her pillows when the old woman's eyes fluttered open. They were clouded, unfocused, looking at Alara but seeing someone else entirely. "Alistair?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Is it done? Have you made your choice?" Alara's hands stilled. A cold dread began to seep into her veins. "I am here, your grace," she said softly. "It is Alara." But the dowager was lost in her own fevered reality, her mind dredging up the secret that had been the foundation of Alara's time at Blackwood. "The plan," she murmured, her fingers plucking at the coverlet. "Davies's clever plan to find you a wife, a true duchess. Is she the one, Alistair? Is this girl, this companion, is she strong enough? Is she good enough to be the Duchess of Blackwood?" The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow against Alara's heart. Duchess of Blackwood. The title echoed in the silent room, monstrous and unbelievable. Her gaze shot to the doorway where he stood. He had just entered, drawn by the sound of his aunt's voice. The look on his face, a rictus of horror, despair, and utter devastation, was all the confirmation she needed. The truth crashed down upon her with the force of a physical assault. Mr. Ashworth, the stern but caring estate manager. The man who had shared his vulnerability with her in the firelight. The man who had kissed her with such desperate tenderness in the garden. He did not exist. He was a fiction, a role played by a reclusive, powerful duke. She was not a companion. She was a candidate. Her kindness, her practicality, her very character, it had all been under examination. It was a test, a cold, cruel, methodical test to see if she was good enough. Every shared moment, every quiet conversation, every tentative touch was instantly recast in a new, hideous light. His vulnerability in the library, was that staged? His defense against VC, was it a display of his power? The kiss. Oh God, the kiss. Was it the final part of the assessment? A confirmation that she was suitably pliable, suitably enamored of her potential master. Her blood ran cold. The warmth she had felt for him curdled into a sickening sense of betrayal. She felt like a fool, a naive, trusting fool who had been played with by a bored, cynical aristocrat. "Your Grace." The man in the doorway took a step into the room, his voice raw. He was looking at her, his gray eyes pleading, begging her to understand. Elara rose from her chair, her movements stiff, robotic. She looked from the delirious dowager to the Duke, the true Duke of Blackwood, standing before her in his magnificent deceit. All the power, all the wealth, all the arrogance of his class seemed to hang around him like a shroud. "Was any of it real?" she whispered, her voice so faint it was barely audible. It was the only question that mattered. Or was it all just part of the interview? "Elara, please," he began, taking another step toward her, his hand outstretched. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" she shot back, her voice gaining a sharp, brittle strength. "That you are a liar? That you hid behind a false name to manipulate me? To judge me like a piece of livestock? There is nothing to explain. There is only the truth you so carefully concealed." She looked at him, at the handsome face, the torment in his eyes, the scar that she had once seen as a mark of his pain and now saw only as a part of his monstrous disguise. The man she had been falling in love with had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. The heartbreak was a physical agony, a sharp, shattering pain in her chest. Without another word, she turned and walked from the room, leaving him standing alone with the ruins of his grand deception. The betrayal was a clean, sharp blade through the heart. There was no room for explanation, no space for forgiveness. There was only the cold, hard fact of the deception. Elara moved through the next hour in a state of numb shock. She returned to her room, the one that had been her sanctuary, and saw it now as a gilded cage, a stage for the Duke's elaborate play. Her few belongings were packed with a swift, desperate efficiency. She worked on autopilot, her mind refusing to process the full scope of the pain, focusing instead on the simple, mechanical task of folding her worn gowns and placing them in her valise. She would not stay another minute under his roof. To do so would be to accept her role as the duped fool, the subject of his cruel experiment. Her dignity was the only possession she had left in the world, and she would not allow him to take that from her. She penned a short, stark note, her hand surprisingly steady. "Your Grace, I cannot remain in a house built on such a foundation of deceit. My service as a companion is concluded. I require no payment. E. Croft." She left the note on her pillow, a final, definitive statement. She did not bother with the main staircase. She slipped out of the manor through a servant's entrance at the back, a ghost leaving a haunted house. The night was cold and moonless, the wind a mournful cry across the fells. She had no destination, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and Blackwood Manor. She walked until the imposing silhouette of the house was swallowed by the darkness, each step a small act of reclamation, of asserting her own agency. She would not be his duchess. She would not be his project. She would be her own woman, even if it meant returning to the destitution from which she had fled. Back in the sick room, Alistair stood frozen, the echo of her whispered accusation. Was any of it real? Reverberating in the silent air. Her question had flayed him open, exposing the rotten core of his own fear and cowardice. He had been so terrified of being wanted for his title that he had behaved in a way that was utterly unworthy of any title at all. He had treated her not as a person, but as a problem to be solved, a position to be filled. And in doing so, he had taken something genuine and beautiful and deliberately, methodically, destroyed it. When his aunt's fever finally broke a day later, her mind clearing, she took one look at his ravaged face and Elara's conspicuous absence and knew everything. Her reprimand was quiet, but it cut him deeper than any sword. "You are a fool, Alistair," she said, her voice weak but firm. "You have always hidden from the world, convinced of its venality. You finally found a woman of true worth, of impeccable character, and you drove her away because you could not trust her goodness. You could not trust your own heart. Her words were the unvarnished truth. He retreated into the oppressive silence of his home. The manor, which had begun to feel alive with Alara's presence, now reverted to its former state. A cold, granite tomb. Every room held her ghost. He saw her in the library, curled in the chair by the fire. He saw her in the garden, her face smudged with dirt and lit with a determined smile. The light she had brought with her was gone, and the darkness that rushed in to fill the void was blacker and more profound than anything he had known before. He was the beast of Blackwood once more, but now he was not just a recluse. He was the sole, tormented architect of his own misery. The comfort he had sought had turned to ash, and the feelings he couldn't deny were now the instruments of his deserved punishment. Weeks bled into a month of desolate, gray monotony. Alistair learned through Mr. Davies's discreet inquiries that Alara had found refuge in the small market town of Oakbridge, some 20 miles distant. She had taken a room above a baker's shop and was earning a meager living as a seamstress. The image of her, her elegant fingers pricked and raw from needlework, her sharp mind dulled by the repetitive, mind-numbing labor, was a constant, agonizing torment to him. He had offered her a palace and, through his own folly, condemned her to a garret. The first impulse of the Duke was to send a carriage, a fat purse of gold, to command her return, to solve the problem with the blunt instruments of wealth and power that he had always relied upon. But the man who had been touched by Alara's quiet grace knew that was the wrong answer. That was the response of the Duke who had deceived her, not the man who had fallen in love with her. To win her back, if she could be won back at all, he could not command. He had to atone. He had to dismantle the very edifice of pride and fear that had led him to this point. The grand gesture required was not one of wealth, but of profound, terrifying vulnerability. He had to show her the man, not the title. He had to earn her forgiveness. One crisp autumn morning, he did not summon his carriage. He rode out on his own horse, dressed not as a duke, but as Mr. Ashworth had been, in simple, durable country clothes. He rode to Oakbridge, the journey a pilgrimage of repentance. He found the baker's shop, the smell of fresh bread a stark contrast to the stale air of his own life. He dismounted, his heart a heavy, anxious drum in his chest. He found her in a small, cramped room on the second floor. The space was clean but threadbare, sunlight from a single grimy window illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She was bent over a piece of fine silk, her needle flashing, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked thinner, paler, and the sight of her weariness was a fresh stab of guilt. She looked up as his shadow fell across her work. Her eyes widened, first in shock, then in a flash of anger, her face closing off, becoming a mask of cold, polite neutrality. "Your Grace," she said, her voice devoid of all warmth. "You are a long way from home. Are you lost?" The barb was subtle, but it hit its mark. He did not answer her sarcasm with arrogance. He stood in the doorway of her small room, a giant humbled. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I am not lost. I have been. But I am not anymore. I came to find you. I am not in need of being found," she replied, turning her attention back to her sewing, a clear, cutting dismissal. He did not leave. He took a hesitant step into the room. "Alara, I did not come to make excuses. There are none for what I did. It was dishonorable. It was cruel. And it was born of a fear so deep I allowed it to make me a coward." He began to speak, the words coming in a raw, halting confession. He told her everything. He spoke of the war, of the friends he had lost, of the scars inside that were so much deeper than the one on his face. He told her of his return to a world that saw only his title, of the grasping hands and false smiles that had made him retreat into himself, convinced that no one could ever see the man beneath the dukedom. "I was so afraid of being valued for the wrong reasons," he said, his voice cracking with the force of his emotion, "that I committed the greater sin. I failed to value you for the right ones. I saw your goodness, your strength, your integrity, And instead of trusting it, I kept testing it. I was a fool. I broke your trust, and I have spent every moment since regretting it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, sealed with his ducal ring. He placed it on the small table beside her. "This is the deed to the bailiff's cottage at the home farm," he said quietly. "The one you helped save. It is yours. It is in your name. There are no conditions, no strings. I want you to have it, so that you will never again be at the mercy of circumstance. So that you will always have a place of your own, a place of safety. Whether you ever wish to see me again or not." He had laid his soul bare. He had offered her not a bribe but security, not a command but a choice. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, all his pride stripped away. "I am not asking you to be my duchess," he said, his voice thick. "I am not worthy of that. I am asking for your forgiveness, for a chance, however small, to show you that the man who fell in love with you in the garden is real, even if the name he used was not. Let me start again, Elara. Honestly, this time." He turned and walked away, leaving the deed on the table, leaving the choice entirely, utterly, in her hands. He had made his grand gesture, not of power, but of surrender. Elara sat for a long time after he had gone, the sound of his retreating footsteps echoing in the silence. His confession, so raw and honest, had chipped away at the icy wall she had built around her heart. He had not excused his actions. He had owned them. He had shown her the wounded man she had first glimpsed in the firelight, the man she had believed him to be before the devastating reveal. The deed on the table was more than a gift of property. It was proof of his transformation. He was giving her power, independence, everything a woman in her position craved, with no expectation of repayment. It was an act of genuine, selfless atonement. A week later, a small cart carrying a few meager belongings made its way up the long drive to Blackwood Manor. It did not stop at the grand front entrance. It continued on to the small, sturdy cottage at the home farm. Elara had come home, but on her own terms. Alistair saw the smoke rising from the cottage chimney, and his heart, which had felt like a stone in his chest for weeks, gave a painful, hopeful leap. He did not rush to her. He gave her space. The next day he walked from the manor to the cottage, not as a duke visiting a tenant, but as a man calling on a neighbor. He brought not jewels or fine gifts, but a basket of fresh vegetables from the manor's kitchen garden and a small, struggling rose bush he had dug up from his mother's walled garden. He found her outside, sweeping the stone step. She looked up as he approached, a cautious, uncertain expression on her face. "A housewarming gift," he said, offering her the basket and the rose bush. She took them, her fingers brushing his. The small shock of contact was still there, a current of awareness that neither of them could deny. "Thank you," she said softly. And so their courtship began again. An honest one this time. He was the Duke of Blackwood, and she was Miss Croft, the independent mistress of her own small home. He came to her in her world. They walked the fields, not the manicured lawns of the manor. They talked for hours, rebuilding the trust he had shattered, piece by painful, honest piece. He told her his Christian name, and she, in turn, began to use it. The society of the county was scandalized. The reclusive, monstrous duke was courting an impoverished spinster who lived in a farmer's cottage on his own estate. It was absurd, unthinkable. Alistair ignored them all. He had spent a lifetime caring what the world thought, and it had brought him nothing but misery. Elara's opinion was the only one that mattered. 2 months later, on a crisp afternoon with the scent of wood smoke in the air, he asked her to marry him. He did not do it in the grand drawing room of the manor. He did it on her doorstep at her cottage, as he was about to take his leave. "Elara Croft," he said, his voice steady and clear, "you are the finest, strongest, most honorable person I have ever known. You saved me from myself. Will you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, Alistair," she whispered. "Yes." They were married a month later in the simple village church, a service attended by his aunt, Mr. Davies, and the tenants of the estate. There were no lords and ladies, no grand spectacle. It was a quiet, sincere ceremony that bound two people who had found each other through a maze of lies and pain. Months later, Blackwood Manor was transformed. The heavy draperies had been thrown back, the windows washed, and sunlight now streamed into the once gloomy halls. The sound of laughter could often be heard echoing from its rooms. Alistair found Alara in the walled garden, which was now a riot of color and fragrance, the crimson roses she had nurtured blooming in glorious profusion. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was no longer the beast, the haunted recluse. Her love, honest and freely given, had healed the deepest of his wounds. The scar on his face was just a part of him now, no longer the sum of him. "Happy, my love?" he murmured into her hair. She leaned back against him, her hand covering his. His was large and scarred, a duke's hand that had known war. Hers was slender and capable, a woman's hand that had known hardship and work. Together they were a perfect fit. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, her voice content. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, a title that had once seemed like a brand of deceit. But she was not defined by it. She was Alara, the woman who had demanded honesty and, in doing so, had taught a broken duke how to be a whole man. They stood together in the garden. They had both helped bring back to life, a quiet, triumphant symbol of their own hard-won,